A 7.1 magnitude earthquake rocking Venezuela.
A 7.1 magnitude earthquake is a major earthquake, and this was one that happened a little after 6 o'clock Eastern time.
A 22-story tower in eastern Caracas folded into the street like wet cardboard. A waterfront hotel on the coast came down into a single pile of concrete and rebar. The fronts of apartment blocks peeled away in sheets, leaving beds, kitchens, and bathrooms hanging open to the air 5 floors up. This wasn't one earthquake. It was 2 39 seconds apart, and the second was the strongest Venezuela has recorded in more than a century. By Thursday morning, the confirmed dead stood at 164. Almost 1,000 injured. Dozens of buildings down across the capital. And the country's acting president has already said the real number is coming. But here's the detail almost nobody is talking about yet. This earthquake didn't actually hit Caracas. It hit a stretch of farmland 160 kilometers away, and the fault that caused it runs directly underneath the capital it spared. That's not luck. That's a warning. At 6:04 p.m. local time on Wednesday, June 24th, Venezuela's independence holiday. When families were home together, the ground tore open off the country's northern coast. The U.S. Geological Survey logged the first rupture at magnitude 7.2. 39 seconds later, before the first shockwave had even finished rolling through, a second rupture hit, magnitude 7.5, shallower and larger. Within seconds, the shaking reached Caracas. Towers swayed for what survivors describe as 10 to 12 unbroken seconds long enough, by several accounts, to knock people off their feet while trying to walk down a hallway. The damage concentrated hardest in the Altamira and Los Palos Grandes districts, where multiple high-rises came down entirely. A bank building in the capital collapsed. Sin Bolvar International Airport, the country's main gateway, took heavy structural damage mid-evacuation, with ceiling panels falling as passengers ran for the exits. The subway shut down. Gas lines were cut. Power and cell service failed across whole districts at once, right as people were trying to find out if their families were alive. A tsunami advisory went out within minutes for Puerto Rico, the U.S., and British Virgin Islands, and the nearby Dutch islands. It was lifted by that night. The ground was not finished. More than 30 aftershocks have rattled the region since the main rupture, each one sending rescue crews stumbling back from the buildings they were digging through. Acting President Delcy Rodriguez confirmed 200-plus dead and 1,000 injured early Thursday, and was explicit that the toll does not yet include casualties from La Guaira State, the coastal region she called the hardest-hit disaster zone in the country. That number is the start of the story, not the end of it. Here's what should stop you. The epicenter wasn't under Caracas. It was roughly 100 miles west, in rural farm country, along the Yaracuy-Carabobo coast, sugarcane fields, and cattle land, not high rises. And that single fact is most of the reason this is a tragedy of hundreds, and not a catastrophe of tens of thousands. Because this stretch of coastline has broken catastrophically before, and when it has, it broke directly beneath the capital. In 1812, a quake on this same plate boundary leveled Caracas on Holy Thursday, while churches were packed for the holiday. Estimates of the dead that day run as high as 30,000, according to the USGs. In 1900, the belt let go again, in what stood for 125 years as the country's strongest recorded earthquake, a record that fell on Wednesday night. This time, the rupture happened to occur under cane fields instead of concrete towers. That is the only variable that separated a tragedy from a catastrophe, and it's a variable nobody controls. The same fault network runs east from where it broke on Wednesday, straight under La Guaira and Caracas. It has gone off there before. The question this raises isn't whether it happens again. Geologists studying this plate boundary treat that is essentially certain over a long enough timeline. The question is just how much time is left. 6:04 p.m., Wednesday, June 24. The first rupture magnitude, 7.2 strikes near the Yaracuy coast. 6:04 p.m. plus 39 seconds, a second, larger rupture follows magnitude 7.5, only about 10 kilometers deep. USC seismologists have said the two events are so close together in time that even their instruments struggle to separate them cleanly. Within minutes, shaking reaches Caracas, 100 miles away. Tsunami advisories go out for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Within the first 2 hours, 6 aftershocks hit. Sim Bolívar International Airport shuts down. Caracas's metro stops running. That night, the tsunami advisory is lifted. Power, gas, and cell networks remain down across large parts of the capital. By Thursday morning, the confirmed toll reaches 200 dead, 1,000 injured, with the government warning the figure from La Guaira hasn't even been added yet. More than 30 aftershocks have now struck the region. By Thursday afternoon, international search and rescue teams from the United States and more than 24 other countries begin arriving, as the USC's own real-time casualty model puts the odds of the final toll passing 10,000 at close to even. Why does an earthquake 100 miles offshore drop towers in a city that far away? 2 reasons. First, depth. Both ruptures broke shallow, roughly 10 to 20 kilometers down. A deep earthquake spends most of its energy pushing through miles of rock before it ever reaches the surface. A shallow one dumps almost all of that force directly into the ground people are standing on. Second, geology turned Caracas into an amplifier. The capital sits inside a deep bowl of soft sediment. Geophysicists studying the region have explained that this kind of sedimentary basin doesn't just transmit seismic waves, it traps them, bouncing the shaking back and forth and making it last longer and hit harder than the same quake would on solid rock. So a rupture under empty farmland still found a way to fold a 22-story building in Altamira. Now move that exact rupture 100 miles east. Underneath the same bowl-shaped valley, it's built to amplify, and the math stops being about hundreds of casualties. Underneath all of this is a structure most people have never heard of, the Bocan Morn El Pilar fault system, a roughly 1,300-kilometer scar running along almost the entire northern edge of Venezuela. This is where the Caribbean tectonic plate grinds eastward past the South American plate, at a pace of roughly 2 centimeters a year, about the speed your fingernails grow. The plates don't slide smoothly. They lock together, bend, and store the strain for decades, like a spring being slowly wound tighter. When a lock finally fails, the stored energy releases all at once. One specific strand of that system, the San Sebastian Fault, runs directly beneath Caracas itself. It's the strand responsible for 1812. It did not rupture this week. The segment that broke on Wednesday sits roughly 100 miles to the west, on a separate piece of the same belt, which means the system that just devastated a stretch of farmland in Yaracuy still has its most dangerous section. Fully loaded, sitting under a city of millions. This fault keeps something like a calendar. 1812, 1900, 1967, each entry is the same plate boundary releasing stored strain somewhere along its length. 1812 is the one that defines the region's seismic memory. On Holy Thursday, with churches full across 5 cities, Caracas, La Guaira, Barquisimeto, San Felipe, and Merida the ground gave way in the same afternoon. Estimates of the dead, according to the USGs, run as high as 30,000, though historians who've combed parish burial records argue the verified number in Caracas itself was far lower, a reminder that even the death toll of a 200-year-old disaster is still being argued over today. In 1900, the belt ruptured again at a magnitude that stood as Venezuela's strongest recorded quake for the next 125 years. In 1967, a smaller 6.6 magnitude quake still killed more than 200 people in Caracas. A survivor of that event told reporters this week that even after living through it once, Wednesday's shaking was unlike anything he'd felt before. Every one of those earthquakes struck a Venezuela with fewer people and fewer buildings than the one standing today. Caracas has grown into a valley packed with towers since the last time this fault reached the city directly. The buildings that survived a 7.5 from 100 miles away are the same buildings that would have to survive the next one from underneath. The damage didn't stay inside Venezuela's borders. The shaking was felt as far as Bogotá and across the Brazilian Amazon, where buildings in Manaus, Belém, and Macap were evacuated as a precaution, tremors registering more than 1,000 miles from the epicenter. Nearly 8 million Venezuelans now live outside the country. Scattered by over a decade of economic collapse, roughly 1 million of them in the United States, with the largest single concentration in Florida. For that entire diaspora, Wednesday night meant watching the same handful of collapse videos loop online while phone lines into Venezuela stayed dead. The response has been immediate. The U.S. has deployed search and rescue teams and humanitarian assistance. More than 24 other countries, including Colombia, Brazil, the Dominican Republic, Chile, and El Salvador, have pledged aid. The UN has called on Venezuelan authorities to keep information channels open, warning that in the days ahead, the public's ability to get accurate information could become a matter of life and death. The financial exposure is staggering for a country already in economic crisis. The USC's own model gives roughly even odds that economic losses pass $10 billion, with a meaningful probability they exceed $100 billion, a figure that could represent close to a fifth of Venezuela's entire GDP. And that estimate is for a quake that hit farmland. It says nothing about what the same rupture would cost directly beneath a capital city. Tonight, the airport is still closed. Power is still out across whole districts of the capital. Families who lost their homes are sleeping in plazas and parking lots, afraid to go back inside buildings that are still standing but no longer trusted. And 10 kilometers below the coast of Yaracuy, the slab of rock that broke on Wednesday is settling into its new position quiet. For now. The fault it belongs to keeps running east from there. Under La Guaira, under Caracas, under every person who felt the ground move on Wednesday and got to walk away from it. It has done this before, on a much larger scale, in the exact city it just spared. The only thing that's changed since 1812 is how many people are standing in the way the next time it decides to. If you want to understand the disasters that don't make headlines until it's too late, subscribe, because this fault isn't finished, and neither is this story.